Hello everyone. Today we are going to see how to draw what you have in mind without having solid drawing skills, thanks to a technique called photobashing. First, I recommend drawing quick ideas, which can be super simple with basic shape. It's just to get an idea of the composition and depth of your image. I use this technique to help me create this little sketch that bring together references that inspire me with their composition, sometimes with the color as well, or just because the image evokes me something. As you can see, I try to find my main shapes, and I'm adding some shade of gray to differentiate what is in the foreground and what's in the background. As I'm not confident enough to do a color blocking, you can stay in gray for this step, that's totally fine. This is where the work begins. You will need the most accurate references to make your work easier and spend as little time as possible on it. You will need references for almost everything: lighting, the style you want, clouds, and so on. The better you are at drawing, the less you will need these references. Here, as you can see, I have references for everything that composes my image. Whether it's the lake, the ground, the clouds, the Viking drag car, it's essential to have these references in the most accurate perspective possible with your subject, as it is very difficult to correct the perspective later if you don't have solid drawing skills. Now it's time to create a new document, and I advise you to make it twice the size you want. This will allow you to work in details, and once you resize at the end, you will have sharp details that won't be blurry in the final format. I always start with my ground, that will define the horizon line and then my perspective. And from there it's a bit like whatever you want. You can just put images on top of each other without any particular cropping, or just something very rough. But for the need of the video, that will come right after this one, I had fun cropping all my elements relatively precisely with different techniques that I will explain in a future video. Throughout this layout stage, I leave my sketch visible, which allow me to not lose the idea I had during this stage and to go back to all my basic ideas while trying to improve them as I go along. So at this point I made a big mistake by merging a few layers and saved over my previous save without incrementing it. So please don't do what I did. Incremental save your work, it's really important. It didn't stop me from continuing, but it just made me lose a lot of time because I no longer had the selection of layers. Once the layout is done, I put my picture in black and white, and I bring my lighting and color references. In Photoshop, I use the gradient transfer tool to sample the dark and light tones of my references and apply them to my image. I start with the sky because it's what I consider to be the most important part of my image, not only because it takes up the most space, but also because it sets the foundation from my lighting, the colors, atmospheric perspective, and so on. I never forget to always pass my image in black and white just to check if my luminosity corresponds to my references, because thanks to that, at the end, I will have a beautiful atmospheric perspective, but I will come back on this subject in another video. It will be the same process throughout the video. I pass my image to black and white, and with the curve tool, I'll adjust the brightness values, that is the depth of my dark tones, light tones, and mid tones. Only then I use other color tools such as hue saturation, this kind of thing, in color mode only, to not touch anything from my luminosity and only touching the color part. And here you can see that I'm already starting to paint the sky to give it a little more intention without going into details. For this, you can also see at the bottom right that I made a palette from the references just to take the color that are already there, with good brightness depending on whether I'm painting light or shadows. Once I have the main details and composition for my sky, I move on to the foreground. To do this, I define the shapes of what I want to change from my layout and blur what I want to keep. This will allow me later to go back and add details in painting rather than in a pixelated photo. I completely rework the head of this foreground character by staying in simple shapes to not get lost. Only now do I add where the light has illuminated my character, as well as where the shadows are formed. I like to use brushes that already have a very slight variation in brightness and color. It adds details while not doing more effort. Here I'm using a pack, but I can show you how to do it if you're interested. Now I have a level of detail that suits me on the foreground character, maybe even a bit too much. I should have waited before giving so many details to build everything else, but I will come back on it later anyway. Now it's time to move on the second most important element, the one that is in the middle of the composition and toward which all converging perspective points. During the layout stage, the drag car I chose was not in the perspective of my drawing, so I had to put in the correct perspective. To do this, I traced several perspectives with a single vanishing point toward the drag car, which is the center of the composition. Here I want to make a small clarification. All of this is not really a tutorial in the end. It's more a way to explain my process of coming up with ideas without necessarily having a great understanding of perspective. I say this because the perspective here is not really accurate. I use it more as guidelines for the composition rather than true perspective. And you will see at the end that I made slight correction with it. Once my two main elements were roughly defined, I quickly placed some mountains that participate a lot in the composition and positioned the ground level just to be able to correctly position my character. Now I'm tackling my midground character, exactly like the one in the foreground. It's the same process. First, I paint simple shapes that are things different from my layout. Then I blur what I want to keep from the reference. And on this one I put even less detail than on my foreground character because I know it will be further away and therefore less visible. I move on to the next character more quickly and so on. Now all my elements are in place, so I start adding more and more detail progressively until I get the desired results. You can see me duplicating my main character, which is more advanced than all the other, and starting to repaint it to make it a reference for the background. It's the same process every time and for every object or element. First I blur what I want to keep from the reference, then I paint with simple shape things I want to change. I sort the lid and shadow area, add details with a brush, make variation of texture and color. Once I'm happy with this first draft, I leave it as it is and move to the rest. This allows me to come back to it later with a clear head and finish the final details while making sure the brightness of my elements integrates well with the brightness, perspective and details of everything else. Now all my elements are in place and painted, so I just have to refine some details to give them the final look I want. I check for example that the atmospheric depth is respected by passing my image in black and white, and you can see that in this drawing there is a gradient with more contrast and deeper black in the foreground, and if we move toward the back and the mountains, it's less contrasty and saturated. I also use selective correction and color balance in Photoshop in color mode to correct the last color detail. I also paint a bit of sky on the background mountains to make integration easier. I'm thinking about the last detail that will make this image cinematic. For example, the vignetting, the small imperfection, the large blur of movement, and especially in Photoshop with camera raw, I finalized this last detail. It's here in particular that I adjust the final luminosity and the minimal details that make this image like I imagine it. This video was not a tutorial, but more a way to explain or generalize the process for creating a drawing from my ideas, despite the fact that I'm not a very good artist. I will detail all the parts of this video in another video, taking more time, and I will show you other techniques that are much faster but less flexible. So you can create your own work without necessarily mastering out the concept of drawing. In the meantime, know that whatever your technical level is, it should not be a barrier to realizing your own idea. And I will see you in another video.